In a small coastal town where the sun always seemed to shine just a little brighter, Jonathan Caldwell was known as the epitome of success. His name carried weight in business circles, and his wealth made him a local legend. He lived in a sprawling mansion perched atop one of the highest hills, overlooking the ocean with its shimmering waves crashing against jagged cliffs below. The house was a symbol of his achievements, a grand estate filled with expensive art, luxurious furniture, and every modern convenience money could buy. But behind the polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers lay cracks that only those closest to him could see. Jonathan had built his empire through sheer determination, clawing his way up from humble beginnings to become one of the most influential men in the region. However, his rise came at a cost. Over time, he became cold and calculating, treating people more like transactions than human beings. Friends admired him for his ambition but whispered about his ruthless nature when they thought no one was listening. And then there was his family, or rather what remained of it. Years ago, Jonathan adopted Amara, a young girl whose bright smile and curious eyes stood out even among the chaos of an orphanage. At first glance, it seemed like a generous act, a way for him to give back to society while showcasing his philanthropy. But as Amara grew older, it became clear that their relationship wasn't rooted in love or kindness. Instead, it felt transactional, almost mechanical. She was his charity project, something he could parade around at charity galas and mention during interviews to polish his image. Yet beneath her cheerful demeanor, Amara harbored pain and loneliness. Amara was unlike other teenagers. A car accident years earlier had left her paralyzed from the waist down, forcing her to rely on a wheelchair. Despite this challenge, she refused to let it define her. She excelled in school, loved reading books, and dreamed of becoming a writer someday. Her mind was sharp, her wit quick, and her heart full of hope. But none of these qualities mattered to Jonathan. To him, she represented inconvenience. He saw her disability not as something to embrace, but as a burden that tarnished his perfect facade. Whenever they attended events together, he would subtly distance himself from her, speaking to her only when necessary, and often with thinly veiled irritation. The townsfolk noticed this strange dynamic between father and daughter. Some pitied Amara, wondering how someone so kind and talented could endure such neglect. Others dismissed it, assuming Jonathan simply struggled to connect emotionally due to his demanding career. But deep down, everyone sensed there was more to the story. On the outskirts of town, far removed from Jonathan's world of opulence, lived Sarah. She was a quiet, observant teenager who worked part-time at a quaint cafe nestled near the cliffs. The cafe attracted tourists eager to sip coffee while gazing at the breathtaking views of the sea. For Sarah, the job was both a source of income and an escape from her own complicated home life. Her parents were divorced, and though she loved them dearly, their constant bickering left her yearning for peace. Working at the cafe gave her a sense of purpose and allowed her to watch the world unfold without being directly involved in its drama. One afternoon, as Sarah wiped down tables and refilled sugar bowls, she noticed a familiar figure walking along the cliffside path. It was Jonathan Caldwell, impeccably dressed as always, pushing a wheelchair ahead of him. In the chair sat Amara, her face turned toward the horizon, her expression unreadable from a distance. Sarah had seen them together before, usually at formal events covered by local newspapers. But today felt different. There was tension in the air, a palpable unease that made Sarah pause mid-task and glance outside again. As Jonathan and Amara drew closer to the edge of the cliff, Sarah couldn't help but eavesdrop. Though she couldn't hear every word, snippets of their conversation drifted toward her, the sharp tone of Jonathan's voice contrasting sharply with Amara's softer replies. Occasionally, Amara gestured animatedly, as if trying to explain something important. Jonathan, however, didn't seem interested. His body language radiated impatience, his hands gripping the handles of the wheelchair tightly. Sarah watched intently, her curiosity piqued. Something about the scene unsettled her. Maybe it was the way Jonathan kept glancing over his shoulder, as if making sure no one else was around. Or perhaps it was the stiffness in Amara's posture, the subtle tension in her shoulders that hinted at discomfort. Whatever it was, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cliffs. Tourists trickled into the cafe, ordering drinks and snapping photos of the scenery. Yet Sarah's attention remained fixed on the pair outside. She told herself it was none of her business, that wealthy families often had private struggles outsiders couldn't understand. Still, she couldn't look away. And then it happened. A sudden movement caught her eye. Jonathan raised his hand, pointing toward the ocean as if emphasizing a point. Amara turned her head slightly, her lips moving as if responding. But before Sarah could process what she was seeing, Jonathan leaned forward abruptly. His hands pushed hard against the wheelchair, sending it rolling dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. Time seemed to freeze. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as she dropped the rag she'd been holding. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she'd just witnessed. Was it an accident? Had Jonathan lost control somehow? Or had he done it on purpose? Her thoughts spiraled as she stared at the spot where the wheelchair had disappeared over the side. Panic surged through her veins, followed by a wave of nausea. She wanted to scream, to run outside and check if Amara was okay, but fear rooted her to the spot. What if Jonathan saw her? What if he realized she'd been watching? For several agonizing seconds, Sarah stood frozen, torn between action and inaction. Finally, she forced herself to move, grabbing her phone and dialing emergency services with trembling fingers. As she relayed the details of what she'd seen, her voice cracked under the weight of her emotions. She didn't know whether she'd done enough, or if it was already too late. The sound of sirens pierced the otherwise peaceful afternoon, slicing through the gentle hum of waves crashing against the jagged rocks below. Emergency vehicles screeched to a halt near the edge of the cliff, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the landscape. Paramedics rushed toward the scene, ropes and medical kits in hand, while police officers cordoned off the area to keep onlookers at bay. Sarah stood frozen just a few feet away, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the chaos unfolding around her. She clutched her phone tightly, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The push, the wheelchair tipping forward, the sickening realization that Jonathan Caldwell might have done something unthinkable. Amara's wheelchair had come to rest precariously on a narrow ledge about halfway down the cliff. It was a miracle it hadn't tumbled all the way to the jagged rocks below. From where Sarah stood, she could see paramedics carefully securing harnesses around Amara, who lay motionless in the chair. Her head lolled slightly to one side, her eyes closed, and for a brief moment Sarah feared the worst. Was she unconscious? Injured, or worse? Had she not survived the fall? Jonathan Caldwell paced back and forth near the top of the cliff, his tailored suit now rumpled and his usually composed demeanor replaced by frantic energy. He spoke rapidly into his phone, his voice sharp and clipped as he barked orders to someone on the other end. Occasionally, he glanced toward the emergency responders, his expression alternating between concern and irritation. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a distraught father desperate for news about his daughter's condition. But Sarah knew better. She had seen the truth, or at least what she believed to be the truth, and it gnawed at her insides like a relentless predator. As the rescue operation continued, Sarah found herself replaying every detail of the argument she'd overheard earlier. Though she hadn't caught every word, fragments of the conversation lingered in her memory. Amara's voice had been calm but firm, almost pleading, as if she were trying to reason with him. "You don't care about me," she'd said at one point, her tone tinged with sadness rather than anger. "I'm just another thing you can use to make yourself look good." Jonathan's response had been harsh and dismissive. "You think I wanted this?" He'd snapped, his voice rising sharply. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused me? People look at us and see weakness, not strength. You're a liability, Amara, a burden I didn't ask for." Sarah shuddered as those words echoed in her mind. They painted a picture far darker than the polished image Jonathan presented to the world. Beneath his charming smile and expensive suits lay a man consumed by ego and pride, willing to sacrifice even those closest to him if it meant protecting his reputation. And now, Standing here amidst the whirlwind of activity, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she'd witnessed something monstrous. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the paramedics managed to secure Amara and begin hoisting her back up the cliff. A stretcher awaited her at the top, surrounded by medical personnel ready to assess her injuries. As soon as she was safely on solid ground, they worked quickly, checking her vitals and stabilizing her before loading her into an ambulance. The entire process unfolded in a blur of urgency, leaving little room for questions or reflection. Yet, Sarah noticed one crucial detail. Despite the commotion, Jonathan made no move to approach his daughter. Instead, he hung back, speaking quietly with a police officer who had arrived on the scene. Curiosity got the better of Sarah, and she edged closer, straining to hear their conversation. Jonathan's tone was measured now, devoid of the panic he'd displayed moments earlier. "It was an accident," he insisted, his hands gesturing emphatically. "She was trying to get a better view of the ocean, and the wheelchair slipped. I tried to grab her, but it happened so fast." His words sounded rehearsed, almost mechanical, as if he'd already prepared this explanation long before the incident occurred. The officer nodded thoughtfully, jotting notes onto a small pad. "We'll need to investigate further," he said, his voice neutral. "There are some inconsistencies we'll need to address." Jonathan stiffened visibly but quickly masked his reaction with a practiced smile. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "I'm more than happy to cooperate. My priority right now is my daughter's recovery." Sarah's stomach churned as she watched him. He was good, too good. Even under scrutiny, he maintained his composure, projecting an image of innocence that most people would find convincing. But Sarah wasn't most people. She had seen the raw anger in his eyes, the deliberate movement of his hands as he pushed the wheelchair. No matter how hard he tried to spin the narrative, she knew the truth. And that knowledge weighed heavily on her shoulders. By the time the ambulance carrying Amara sped away, sirens blaring, the sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the cliffs. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves about the tragic accident they'd witnessed. Sarah lingered behind, her thoughts a tangled mess. She wanted to tell someone what she'd seen, to expose Jonathan for the monster she believed him to be. But fear held her back. What if no one believed her? What if Jonathan retaliated, using his wealth and influence to silence her? The risks seemed insurmountable, yet the alternative, staying silent, felt equally unbearable. As she walked back to the cafe, her legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. Inside, the cozy atmosphere provided little comfort. Customers chatted animatedly about the drama they'd just witnessed, oblivious to the turmoil brewing within Sarah. She busied herself with cleaning tables and refilling coffee cups, hoping the mundane tasks would distract her from the storm raging in her mind. But no amount of routine could erase the images burned into her memory. The push, the fall, the cold indifference in Jonathan's eyes. That evening, after closing up the cafe, Sarah sat alone in her tiny bedroom, staring at the ceiling as tears streamed down her face. She replayed the events of the day over and over, searching for answers she didn't have. Should she go to the police? Would they take her seriously or dismiss her as a hysterical teenager with an overactive imagination? And what about Amara? If Sarah stayed quiet, would Jonathan try to harm her again? The questions swirled endlessly, each one more daunting than the last. Finally, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted into a restless sleep. But even in her dreams, the scene at the cliff haunted her. She saw Amara's wheelchair teetering on the edge, heard Jonathan's harsh words echoing in the wind, and then, just as the chair began its descent, Sarah woke with a start, her heart racing and her sheets damp with sweat. The next morning, Sarah resolved to act. She couldn't let fear dictate her choices, not when someone's life might depend on her courage. Grabbing a notebook and pen, she began documenting everything she remembered about the incident. Every word of the argument, every detail of Jonathan's behavior, every emotion she'd felt in that moment. It all poured onto the pages in a jumble of ink and desperation. Writing it down made it real, tangible, something she could hold on to, when doubt crept in. When she finished, Sarah stared at the notebook, her resolve strengthening. She didn't know what the future held or how her actions might change things, but one thing was certain. She couldn't stand idly by while injustice went unchecked. Not anymore. The days that followed Amara's fall felt like an eternity for Sarah. Each morning she woke up with a knot in her stomach, replaying the events on the cliff over and over again in her mind. The notebook she'd filled with her account of what happened sat hidden under her mattress, its weight both literal and metaphorical. She knew it contained vital information, but the thought of sharing it terrified her. Jonathan Caldwell wasn't just any man. He was powerful, wealthy, and well-connected. Going against someone like him felt like stepping into a storm without shelter. Yet, as the hours ticked by, Sarah found herself increasingly unable to ignore the nagging voice inside her head. What if I'm the only one who can stop him? Amara remained in the hospital, unconscious and hooked up to machines that beeped steadily in rhythm with her heartbeat. Doctors said she had suffered severe injuries during the fall, including broken ribs, internal bleeding, and a fractured skull. While they were cautiously optimistic about her recovery, there was no telling when, or if, she would wake up. News of her condition spread quickly through the small coastal town, sparking whispers and speculation among residents. Some believed the official story Jonathan had told, that it was a tragic accident caused by a momentary lapse in attention. Others weren't so sure. Sarah paid close attention to these conversations, picking up fragments of gossip wherever she went. At the cafe where she worked, customers debated whether Amara's disability might have contributed to the accident. One woman suggested that navigating cliffs in a wheelchair was inherently dangerous, while another countered that Jonathan should have been more careful given his daughter's circumstances. None of them seemed to suspect foul play, which only deepened Sarah's sense of isolation. How could she convince anyone that what she'd seen wasn't an accident at all? Her anxiety reached a breaking point one evening when she overheard two co-workers talking about the incident. "Poor girl," one of them said, shaking her head. "It must be hard growing up with someone like Jonathan Caldwell as your dad. He's always so focused on appearances, you know. I bet he resented having to deal with a kid in a wheelchair." Sarah froze mid-task, her hands gripping the edge of the counter tightly. For a split second, she considered speaking up, telling them everything she knew, but fear stopped her. What if they didn't believe her? Worse yet, what if word got back to Jonathan? She imagined him showing up at her doorstep, his cold eyes boring into hers, demanding to know why she dared to question him. The image sent chills down her spine. That night, Sarah decided she couldn't keep this burden to herself any longer. She needed help, someone she could trust, someone who might understand the gravity of the situation and guide her toward the right course of action. Her thoughts immediately turned to her older brother, Ethan. Though he lived in a neighboring town, Ethan had always been her rock, offering advice and support whenever life became overwhelming. A former investigative journalist, he had spent years chasing stories that exposed corruption and injustice before trading his career for a quieter life as a high school teacher. If anyone could help her navigate this mess, it was him. The next day, after finishing her shift at the cafe, Sarah called Ethan. Her voice trembled as she recounted the events on the cliff, describing every detail she could remember. The argument, the push, Jonathan's demeanor afterward. There was a long pause on the other end of the line when she finished, and for a moment Sarah feared he wouldn't take her seriously. But then Ethan spoke, his tone calm, yet firm. "Sarah, listen to me," he said. "This is serious. You're not imagining things or exaggerating. You saw something that could change lives. But we need to handle this carefully. People like Jonathan Caldwell don't get to where they are without knowing how to protect themselves. We'll need evidence, and lots of it." Ethan's words gave Sarah a glimmer of hope. Over the next few days, they worked together to gather as much information as possible. Ethan taught her how to document her observations systematically, encouraging her to write down dates, times, locations, and descriptions in meticulous detail. They scoured local news articles and social media posts for mentions of Jonathan and Amara, piecing together a timeline of their strained relationship. Sarah also began paying closer attention to the area near the cliffs, noticing security cameras mounted on nearby buildings and lampposts. With Ethan's guidance, she compiled a list of potential sources of footage that might corroborate her account. One breakthrough came when Ethan discovered a neighbor who lived near the cliffs and owned a home surveillance system. The neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, was initially reluctant to share her recordings, citing privacy concerns. But when Ethan explained the stakes and assured her that her identity would remain anonymous, she reluctantly handed over the footage. It wasn't perfect. The angle was slightly off, and much of the interaction between Jonathan and Amara was obscured by trees and shadows. Still, it captured enough to raise suspicions. Jonathan's aggressive body language, the sudden movement of the wheelchair, and the unmistakable tension in the air. Armed with this new evidence, Sarah and Ethan turned their attention to finding others who might have witnessed Jonathan's mistreatment of Amara over the years. They started discreet conversations with locals, framing their questions casually to avoid arousing suspicion. Slowly but surely, patterns emerged. Several people mentioned seeing Jonathan snap at Amara in public, often berating her for minor mistakes or inconveniences. One shopkeeper recalled overhearing him tell her, "You're lucky I took you in. Don't make me regret it." Another described how he once left Amara waiting outside a restaurant for nearly an hour because he didn't want her wheelchair to ruin the ambiance of the upscale venue. Each testimonial added another layer to the case against Jonathan, painting a picture of a man who viewed his adopted daughter not as family but as a liability. By the time Sarah and Ethan had gathered enough material, they felt confident they had a strong foundation to present to the authorities. But approaching the police wasn't easy. Sarah wrestled with doubts, wondering if they'd dismiss her claims as baseless accusations fueled by jealousy or resentment. To minimize the risk, Ethan suggested submitting the evidence anonymously at first. Together, they drafted a detailed letter outlining Sarah's eyewitness account, attaching copies of the surveillance footage and witness statements. They mailed the package to the local police station late one night, ensuring no fingerprints or identifying marks remained. Weeks passed in agonizing silence. Sarah returned to her routine, working at the cafe and avoiding discussions about the Caldwell family whenever possible. Every knock on the door made her heart race. Every phone call sent her mind spiraling with worst-case scenarios. What if Jonathan found out? What if he retaliated? These fears haunted her dreams, turning her sleep into restless bouts of tossing and turning. Then one crisp morning, news broke that investigators had reopened the case surrounding Amara's fall. Reporters swarmed the hospital, eager for updates on her condition, while detectives interviewed key figures including Jonathan himself. Word spread quickly that new evidence had surfaced, though specifics were kept under wraps. Sarah watched, from afar, her pulse racing as she realized her efforts hadn't been in vain. For the first time since that fateful day on the cliffs, Sarah allowed herself a flicker of hope. Justice might still be a long way off, but at least the wheels were turning. And as she stood behind the counter at the cafe, watching tourists sip their coffee and admire the view of the ocean, she reminded herself of one simple truth. Sometimes, doing the right thing means facing your fears, even when it feels impossible. The reopening of the investigation into Amara's fall sent ripples through the small coastal town. What had initially been dismissed as a tragic accident was now being scrutinized under a harsh new light. Detectives fanned out across the community, revisiting the scene of the incident, interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence that might shed clarity on what truly happened that day. For Sarah, this development brought both relief and anxiety. On one hand, she felt vindicated knowing her anonymous tip had sparked action. On the other hand, the spotlight growing brighter around Jonathan Caldwell meant she could no longer remain safely in the shadows. Amara, meanwhile, remained unconscious in the hospital, her fragile body fighting to heal from the injuries sustained during the fall. Doctors described her condition as stable but critical, emphasizing that recovery would be a long and uncertain process. Her presence loomed large over the investigation, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. Visitors trickled into her room daily, some bearing flowers, others leaving cards filled with well-wishes. Yet despite the outpouring of support, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Everyone knew the stakes. If Amara woke up, her testimony could change everything. Sarah visited the hospital once, lingering nervously outside Amara's room before finally mustering the courage to step inside. The sight of her lying motionless in the bed surrounded by machines and tubes left Sarah feeling hollow. She sat quietly by Amara's side, clutching her hands tightly and whispering words of encouragement. "You're strong," Sarah murmured, her voice trembling. "You've got to wake up. We need you." Though she didn't know Amara personally, Sarah felt a deep connection to her, a shared understanding of what it meant to feel invisible in the shadow of someone else's power. The days turned into weeks. The police investigation intensified. Detectives reviewed the surveillance footage Sarah and Ethan had provided, cross-referencing it with statements from witnesses who had come forward after hearing about the reopened case. One breakthrough came when a local fisherman admitted to seeing Jonathan arguing with Amara near the cliffs earlier that afternoon. His account matched Sarah's description almost perfectly, adding weight to her claims. Another key piece of evidence emerged when technicians analyzed tire marks and scuff patterns at the scene, concluding that the wheelchair hadn't simply slipped. It had been pushed forcefully toward the edge. Jonathan, for his part, maintained his innocence with practiced ease. He granted interviews to reporters, portraying himself as a grieving father, desperate for answers. In one televised segment, he stood beside Amara's hospital bed, his expression somber as he pleaded for privacy during this difficult time. Behind closed doors, however, his demeanor shifted dramatically. Friends and colleagues reported seeing flashes of anger and frustration, particularly when questioned about inconsistencies in his story. Some began to distance themselves, sensing that the tide was turning against him. Sarah watched all of this unfold from afar, her heart pounding each time Jonathan appeared on screen. Every word he spoke felt like a calculated move designed to manipulate public perception, yet she couldn't deny how convincing he sounded. It wasn't until Detective Ramirez, the lead investigator on the case, paid her a visit that Sarah realized her role in the investigation was far from over. Detective Ramirez arrived at the cafe one quiet afternoon, dressed in plain clothes and carrying a notepad. He introduced himself casually, ordering a cup of coffee before pulling Sarah aside for a private conversation. "We've received some compelling information recently," he began, his tone measured. "And we believe you might have insights that could help us." Sarah's stomach churned as she listened, her mind racing with possibilities. Had someone traced the anonymous package back to her? Or had her behavior, her frequent trips to the hospital, her nervous glances whenever Jonathan's name came up, raised suspicions? Whatever the reason, she knew she couldn't lie outright. Instead, she chose her words carefully, confirming bits of what she'd seen without revealing her full involvement. "I was there that day," she admitted hesitantly. "I saw them arguing near the cliff, but I didn't think much of it at first. Then, I saw something happen. Something that made me question whether it was really an accident." Detective Ramirez nodded thoughtfully, jotting notes as she spoke. "Can you tell me more about what you saw?" he asked gently. Even small details could make a difference. For the next hour, Sarah recounted everything: the heated exchange between Jonathan and Amara, the push, the way Jonathan had composed himself afterward. She described how she'd felt frozen in shock, too, scared to intervene or call for help immediately. When she finished, Detective Ramirez thanked her, assuring her that her bravery was helping bring justice to light. "Stay safe," he added as he left, his expression unreadable. Those two words lingered in Sarah's mind long after he was gone, a reminder of the risks she was taking. Word of Sarah's involvement spread quickly, though only among those closest to her. Ethan urged her to stay vigilant, warning her that Jonathan might retaliate if he suspected her of speaking out. "He's cornered," Ethan said grimly. "And people like him don't go down without a fight." To protect herself, Sarah began, documenting every interaction she had with anyone connected to the case, keeping a detailed record of phone calls, emails, and conversations. She also reached out to a local attorney recommended by Ethan, seeking legal advice in case Jonathan tried to silence her. Amidst the chaos, a glimmer of hope emerged. After weeks of lying unconscious, Amara finally stirred. At first, her movements were faint, a twitch of her fingers, a flutter of her eyelids, but soon she opened her eyes fully, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. Nurses rushed to her side, calling for doctors as they assessed her condition. When she regained enough strength to speak, her voice was weak but determined. "What happened?" she asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. Doctors explained the extent of her injuries and assured her that she was safe. But when Detective Ramirez arrived to take her statement, Amara's memory proved sharper than anyone expected. Fragments of the argument on the cliff came flooding back, the bitter words exchanged, the anger in Jonathan's voice, the moment she realized she was in danger. Though her recollection wasn't perfect, it aligned closely with Sarah's account, providing investigators with crucial corroboration. With Amara's testimony bolstering their case, the authorities moved swiftly. They obtained a warrant to search Jonathan's properties, uncovering financial records and communications that hinted at his true motivations for adopting Amara in the first place. Far from being an act of charity, it seemed he had viewed her as a tool to enhance his public image, a trophy to display at galas and fundraisers. Emails revealed plans to cut ties with her entirely, citing concerns about how her disability reflected on his reputation. Each discovery painted a damning picture of a man willing to sacrifice even those closest to him in pursuit of perfection. As the evidence mounted, so did public outrage. News outlets picked up the story, airing interviews with neighbors, former employees, and acquaintances who had witnessed Jonathan's cruelty firsthand. Social media buzzed with hashtags demanding justice for Amara, while protests erupted outside Jonathan's mansion. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that the truth might prevail. Yet even as the walls closed in around Jonathan, Sarah couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her insides. She knew the battle wasn't over, not until a verdict was reached and justice served. Until then, she vowed to keep fighting, drawing strength from the knowledge that she wasn't alone. With Ethan by her side, Amara slowly healing, and an entire community rallying behind them, Sarah faced each new challenge with quiet determination. No matter how hard the road ahead might be, she refused to let fear dictate her choices, not when so much was at stake. The courtroom was packed on the day of Jonathan Caldwell's trial, a sea of faces craning forward to catch a glimpse of the man once revered as a pillar of the community. Reporters jostled for space in the front rows, their cameras clicking incessantly as lawyers, witnesses, and spectators filed in. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, a mix of curiosity and outrage that had been simmering for months finally boiling over. For Sarah, sitting quietly near the back of the room, the scene felt surreal. She'd spent countless sleepless nights wondering if this moment would ever come, if justice would truly prevail. Now, as she watched Jonathan take his seat beside his high-profile defense attorney, her heart pounded with equal parts fear and resolve. The prosecution opened its case with a powerful statement, laying out the timeline of events leading up to Amara's fall. They presented surveillance footage showing Jonathan pushing the wheelchair, expert testimony confirming the force required to send it tumbling toward the edge, and witness accounts describing years of neglect and mistreatment. Amara herself testified via video link from her hospital bed, her voice steady despite the trauma etched into every word. "He never wanted me," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was just something he could use until I became inconvenient." Her testimony struck a chord with everyone in the room, leaving even seasoned reporters visibly shaken. Jonathan's defense team fought back fiercely, painting him as a misunderstood father grappling with the challenges of raising a disabled child. They argued that the surveillance footage was inconclusive, pointing out gaps in the recording and questioning its authenticity. Witnesses who had spoken against him were dismissed as unreliable or motivated by jealousy. At one point, Jonathan himself took the stand, his polished demeanor and practiced speeches designed to sway the jury. He spoke of regret, of moments when he wished he'd done better by Amara, and even shed a few tears for dramatic effect. To some, it might have seemed convincing, but not to Sarah. Throughout the trial, Sarah avoided drawing attention to herself. She kept her head down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and listened intently as each piece of evidence unfolded. Yet, she couldn't escape the weight of knowing she'd played a pivotal role in bringing the case to light. When Detective Ramirez called her to the stand, her stomach churned with nerves. Walking past rows of staring eyes, she reminded herself why she was there. Not for fame or recognition, but because someone needed to stand up for what was right. Under questioning, Sarah recounted the events of that fateful afternoon, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger as she went on. She described the argument, the push, and the chilling indifference Jonathan displayed afterward. When the defense attorney cross-examined her, attempting to poke holes in her story, Sarah held her ground. "I saw what I saw," she said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And I'm not going to stay silent about it." As the days dragged on, the tension in the courtroom became almost unbearable. Closing arguments brought the drama to a crescendo, with both sides delivering impassioned speeches meant to sway the jury. The prosecution painted Jonathan as a calculating man who valued appearances above all else, willing to destroy anyone who threatened his carefully crafted image. The defense countered by portraying him as a flawed but loving father caught in an impossible situation. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on charges of attempted murder and child endangerment. A collective gasp rippled through the room as the judge read the decision aloud. Jonathan sat motionless, his face pale and expressionless, while murmurs of disbelief and satisfaction erupted around him. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered to celebrate the outcome, holding signs that read, "Justice for Amara," and chanting slogans condemning abuse of power. Cameras flashed as reporters scrambled to capture reactions from those involved. Sarah slipped away unnoticed, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. Relief warred with exhaustion, pride mingled with sadness. It was over, but the scars would linger for a long time. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Jonathan was sentenced to 20 years in prison, stripped of his wealth and influence. His empire crumbled under the weight of scandal, leaving behind only whispers of what once was. Meanwhile, Amara started the long journey toward recovery, surrounded by a support system that included foster parents who genuinely cared for her. Though physical therapy and counseling would be ongoing, her spirit remained unbroken. She expressed gratitude to Sarah multiple times, calling her a hero for having the courage to speak out. "You saved me," Amara told her during one visit. "I'll never forget that." For Sarah, the aftermath of the trial brought unexpected changes. Her actions gained widespread attention, earning her praise from strangers and acquaintances alike. Locals hailed her as a symbol of bravery, someone who had stood up to injustice despite overwhelming odds. Offers poured in, from scholarships to speaking engagements. But Sarah declined most of them, preferring to focus on rebuilding her own life. She continued working at the cafe, finding solace in the familiar routine, and leaned heavily on Ethan for guidance and encouragement. Together, they reflected on how far they'd come, marveling at the ripple effects of a single act of courage. Yet Sarah didn't let the spotlight go to her head. Instead, she used her newfound platform to advocate for others in similar situations, joining local organizations dedicated to protecting vulnerable children and supporting survivors of abuse. She gave talks at schools and community centers, sharing her story and urging others to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. "It's scary to speak up," she admitted during one presentation. "But staying silent is scarier. If you see something, say something. You never know whose life you might save." As time passed, the coastal town slowly returned to normalcy, or at least a new version of it. Conversations shifted from scandal to everyday concerns, and the cliffs where the incident occurred became just another part of the landscape. But For those who had lived through it, the memory remained vivid, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of standing up for truth. For Sarah, the experience changed her in ways she couldn't have anticipated. She emerged stronger, more confident, and deeply aware of her ability to make a difference. On quiet evenings, she often found herself gazing out at the ocean, thinking about how close she'd come to letting fear silence her. And each time, she reminded herself of one simple truth. Sometimes doing the right thing means risking everything, even when it feels like the hardest choice you'll ever make.